Welcome to This Explainer. You know, when you hear the word globalization, you probably picture the internet, smartphones, or, I don't know, next day shipping. But what if I told you that our interconnected world is actually a centuries-old epic tale of human connection? It's not just some modern digital age phenomenon. Today, we are going to dive into the absolutely fascinating history of how our modern, interconnected world actually developed. It is a massive, sweeping story, and we're going to break the whole shebang down right here. So let's kick things off by making sure we're on the exact same page. What even is globalization? Well, it isn't just about economics. It's the increasing connection among countries through trade, migration, technology, and culture. Think of it as the blueprint of human connection. It's the movement of things, people, and ideas across borders. Keep this definition in the back of your mind because it's the lens we'll be looking through for the rest of our journey today.
Here is our roadmap for today. First up, we'll look at the ancient roots of globalization. Then we'll move into how food changed everything. After that, industry, migration, and empire, followed by the collapse of trade, and finally, we'll wrap up with rebuilding our interconnected world.
All right, Chapter 1, The Ancient Roots of Globalization. Think about this. Long before cargo planes and supertankers were a thing, the pre-modern world was already incredibly active. Traders were connecting entire continents. Pre-modern goods like silk, spices, and textiles weren't just your everyday items. They were highly valued treasures. They were the very first physical items to move across vast regions, forging the absolute earliest links between different parts of the world. I mean, imagine the immense effort it took to transport this stuff across literal deserts and mountains. These goods completely laid the foundation for global trade as we know it.
We see this perfectly with the legendary Silk routes. These early global highways bridged the physical geography of Asia, Europe, and Africa. But here's the really cool part. They also facilitated massive abstract exchanges. So they weren't just moving physical goods, they were intertwining ideas, philosophies, and religions. It was an intellectual and cultural exchange network just as much as an economic one. Ideas were spreading like wildfire.
Moving right along to Chapter 2, How Food Changed Everything. Let's transition from those massive historical trade routes and shrink these concepts right down to something incredibly relatable. Your dinner plate. Take a second and think about it. Where did your favorite food actually originate? We tend to think of our local cuisines as having been around forever, right? But the truth is, the ingredients in our favorite meals are some of the greatest global travelers in human history. The specific paths these foods took are just fascinating. The potato originated in South America. Maize or corn came from the Americas, and noodles and spices traveled all across Asia. Now, these weren't just tasty new flavors. They were absolute demographic game changers that permanently transformed global agriculture and modern diets. The introduction of the potato, for example, completely altered the agricultural landscape and spurred massive population booms across other continents. So our modern diets, they're the direct result of pre-modern globalization. Which brings us to Chapter 3, Industry, Migration, and Empire. As we roll into the 19th century, the slow, steady pace of the pre-modern world completely vanishes. It's replaced by this explosive acceleration of global connections. And this boom was really driven by three main engines. First, the Industrial Revolution created massive factories that demanded raw materials and new markets. Second, better transport, like steamships and railways, moved goods faster than ever before. And third, colonization reshaped global political boundaries to serve these new economic demands. This was a powerful, totally unstoppable chain reaction. And the human impact of this shift? Staggering. We are talking about millions. During this period, millions of people migrated across the globe. Driven by the need for jobs and new opportunities, massive waves of people packed up and moved to places like America and Australia. So this wasn't just a movement of goods anymore, It was an unprecedented movement of humanity, permanently altering the cultural makeup of the entire globe.
Now, as part of this 19th century expansion, the economic dynamic of colonialism was pretty straightforward. European powers controlled colonies specifically to secure raw materials and markets for their booming industries. Under colonial rule, India exported massive quantities of key goods: cotton to feed the textile mills, indigo for dyes, and opium. These specific resources were essentially extracted and injected directly into the global trade network, fueling that era's rapid industrial growth.
Now for a somewhat darker turn. Chapter 4, The Collapse of Trade. So this relentless march of progress we just talked about, it wasn't permanent, not by a long shot. The vast, interconnected world that had been built up over centuries suddenly faced a cascade of devastating shocks. First, World War I violently disrupted global trade. Then, just as the world tried to catch its breath and recover, it was hit by the Great Depression, which was followed immediately by World War II. These three consecutive events violently tore apart the international trade network that had taken literally centuries to build. To really grasp the severity of this collapse, let's zoom in on the Great Depression for a second. The brutal reality meant falling trade, massive unemployment, and severe economic hardship. When countries suddenly stopped trading with each other, factories closed, jobs completely vanished, and everyday people suffered immensely. It was a stark reminder that globalization isn't just about generating wealth. When the system breaks down, the economic pain is felt globally. Finally, Chapter 5, Rebuilding Our Interconnected World. Emerging from the absolute devastation of two world wars and the Great Depression, the global community faced a monumental task, stitching their broken connections back together. The harsh lesson learned from the collapse of trade was clear: isolation leads to conflict and poverty. So after World War II, new international organizations were established specifically to promote global trade. And the goal was very intentional: to ensure economic interconnectedness. Leaders believed, right, that if countries were economically tied together through robust trade networks, they would be far less likely to go to war and far more likely to prosper together. The world economy had to be carefully, deliberately rebuilt from the ground up. And that brings us to the end of our journey today. But I want to leave you with a critical question to chew on. Given this epic history of connection, from the ancient Silk routes to the total collapse of trade in the 20th century and the deliberate rebuilding of the modern era, how deeply does our modern survival rely on remaining economically interconnected? Understanding how our world actually became global helps us realize just how fragile, yet absolutely crucial, our interconnectedness really is. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. And hey, keep looking out for those connections all around you.